I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Everyone, welcome to the show. I'm here with, I gotta say, my best podcast mate, Dan from Casting Views, one of my oldest podcasting friends, one of my favorite guests from across the pond and just in general. And I'm really excited to have this conversation today because we're taking a little bit of a sidestep from normal cult-worthy topics and discussions and going more into the world of his show, but kind of bringing them together because I have had this deep, dark feeling lately, and I've been trying to figure out what it is, and hopefully Dan can help me figure it out. So with no further ado, Dan, Casting Views, how are you?
I am very well. I'm all the more excited to be back on the Cultworthy as well and seeing your wonderful face. So yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. When you kind of put forward to me the conversation that you wanted to have on this episode, yeah, I thought, yeah, let's do this.
Because, we had done our Brit Grit episode like half a year ago. It's been a few months, and we were going to do a sequel to it. But I've been having, like I said, this doom and gloom about me from, I think, being too much on social media. On my other show, The MILF and Me, I go through TikTok and Instagram Reels, looking at dating videos and dating gurus. But then the algorithm sometimes does something to you where it's like if you like a video or if you maybe spend too much time watching a certain subject, it starts giving you more. And it brought me into this weird rabbit hole of what I'm going to call fear mongering and doom mongering. And the more I think about it, the more that I've seen it on social media, the more I start making the connections of what we're seeing in mainstream media, on TV and in movies. And then I start putting those pieces together of, okay, well, that's what's going on now. I start thinking about my teenage years and my childhood and realize that this has been something that's been going on for as long as mainstream media has existed. And so I wanted to have this conversation with you because, A, this is kind of what your podcast does. It takes topical subjects and you discuss it with other people. And I'm like, well, if I'm going to have this conversation with anybody, it's going to be with Dan.
Yeah, and absolutely. And as you say, I think the films definitely have a history of it. I mean, when I was kind of just looking at the subject around on the net, and even on Wikipedia, it's kind of like just how far back the sense of fear mongering in films and disaster movies and end of the world apocalypse. It's oh, I was going to say it's almost as old as time itself, but I guess it's almost as old as stories exist, right?
Exactly. It makes me wonder, as long as the human race has been able to, let's say, document its existence and do poetry and prose, there's always been a fascination with the demise of our species and the demise of our world and the collapse of our society. Because it's happened in history many, many times. Biblical times, natural disasters, catastrophes, cataclysms, in the Bible, in the Bhagavad Gita, in every ancient text, there is stories and prophecies of doom and gloom. It's just something that we're obsessed with. And maybe that's because, yes, we can't think like an animal per se, but we can kind of study how they act and how their synapses work, where we are so constantly conscious of our own mortality and the mortality of our loved ones and of our progeny. Everyone that is dear to us, we are concerned about their well-being, we are concerned about their future, and it makes us fear anything that happens to them that could be bad or on a grander scale. And it makes me wonder, like, okay, so when we get into the realm of entertainment and mainstream media, how much of that is constructed by, let's say, elites, higher powers, people that we are not aware of their existence, but there has to be something out there. That's where like the real conspiracy nuts go into play. Or then if we're just saying, oh, well, this is just life and we are just creatures on this planet and there's a cycle to things, things begin and things end. That's where this conversation, I think, really is going to get interesting, because there's always been conspiracy nuts. There's always been people who have been doom and gloom and preppers and doomsday guys. But in the last 15, 20 years, with social media being so just part of our life, that message has gone out to people on a mass scale. And it makes me wonder if that mass scale of paranoia is at an all-time high. And then we see conflict in the world and we see conflict on television and on our smartphone. How much are we letting it affect our day-to-day life? When in the old days, it was just your crazy uncle in the trailer park who was talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And sharing stories on his ham radio. It's different now.
It's odd. I think one of the films that you will probably mention, and one of the ones that I know you put my way, when you were thinking about the theme of this, is it just feels like the world is supposed to have got almost bigger with with technology and the internet. That we've got everything at our fingertips. The world is supposed to be there for us, but if anything, and especially in recent years, it feels like the world has got insular, like you said. And I feel, rather than now being able to go out there and we can get information from everywhere and hear this person's story or that person's story or that view and that view, we are just, well, when I say we, the majority of people, we are just surrounding ourselves in echo chambers. And I think it feels almost like the world is getting smaller rather than there being a whole world out there to explore. It feels like people are surrounding themselves with only the view they want to hear. And as you say, I think I've had some conversations with people recently, and they're all saying the same thing as how you've summarized this beautifully in the first sort of few minutes. Is it just feels like almost like people are kind of suffocating with the conspiracies and the stories and the kind of like the shadowy elements that are out there sort of conspiring. It feels like it's a very common feeling, especially in the current day.
It makes you wonder how much is self-manifested, because that's one of the things I find interesting about the human species, is that we manifest where other creatures on this planet don't. We have these ideas of either optimistic or pessimistic futures for ourselves, and we have to have some kind of sense of closure or self-gratification to make that part of our mind that's noisy quiet down. So either it's something that has to happen that's really good, or something that has to happen that's really bad. And the difference between us and other creatures on this planet is that we are actually in control of how that manifests. And some people, and they've said this for centuries, they will manifest their own demise because it's something they can't get out of their mind. They are so obsessed of how they're going to die. They are so obsessed of how life is just treating them poorly and they don't have a chance, that anything good, they completely just push aside because they've already kind of centered in on what they feel their manifestations should be. So in a weird sense, they're kind of creating their own doom and demise, and they don't even realize it. We're the only species that does that.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I was just going to catch on to a word you said there about control, because I was thinking about that as well. And absolutely, as you said, we are almost conditioned from a young age to think about death. Are you planning for your funeral? Are you planning for your dependents? So it feels like right from the outset, I'm not saying from a child or toddlers, but, once you get to that certain age, you're told to prepare for things like that. But also, do you feel that as humans, we like to feel that we are in control of our life and our destiny, but the things that films and social media does is almost feel like you don't have a control. You're at the mercy of others' control sometimes, and that it's not you.
That's the idea of being human. And there's always been class warfare, and there's always been like this great divide between the peasants and the serfs and the elites. That's something that's always existed. There's always been someone higher, there's always been someone lower, and where the real control of the people that are higher is making people feel like they are in control of their own destiny, when who knows, they might not be. And that's where the conspiracists come in.
Yeah.
Where this gets fascinating to me is how much of that fear and despair that we are definitely seeing in our society today. I mean, get on TikTok and everyone's like, does anyone else feel like the world is ending right now? Well, yeah, because we're saturated in it. We're saturated in it on the news. We're saturated in what movies and television. And the reason why this was a great thing for you to be on is that you've been doing episodes of your show dedicated to reviews of Black Mirror.
Yes.
Which has got several seasons now. You're going episode by episode. And that's one of the things too, where it's like, oh, how deep does this cycle go, where the subject matter of Black Mirror and other shows like it is how little control us regular people actually have, and how much of our reality is manufactured. Whether it's the idea of a simulation, whether it's the idea that the elites rule everything, which they kind of do in my opinion. And all that's doing is it's turning paranoia into entertainment. And entertainment seems to be the way to convince us, humans, that we are just fooling ourselves into what's actually real, right?
Yeah.
Because there's something in our mind where it's like, well, they wouldn't be showing us what they're really doing on TV, right? They wouldn't just be giving it away. Well, why not? The best way to convince someone that they're not fooling around with us is to show us exactly how they're doing it and then pass it off as entertainment, because the part of our brain that's like trying to be rational about it would be like, well, they wouldn't show us what they're really doing. They wouldn't really show us that we're in a simulation. They wouldn't really show us that we are genetically manufactured by another higher power, and we are just used for our labor and our control and all those different things. But at the same time, it's kind of creepy that, like, well, that's the perfect way to get us to ignore the fact, is pretend that it's entertainment, pretend that it's fiction, pretend that it's fantasy.
Yeah, the constant drip feeding is what makes it more manageable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and as you say, I do remember that sort of, especially, I think it was probably around the 90s with the, kind of like the real boom in alien films or extraterrestrials. And again, I remember in the headlines here, it was, is Hollywood preparing us for an alien invasion? Are they already here? And these films are just, I mean, Men in Black kind of played on that trope, didn't it?
On a comedy and satirical level.
Yeah. But was it factual? And is it a documentary?
So it's interesting to go back into the list of films and novels for as long as, mass media has been a thing. Now, I was born in 81. You're a few years older than me, but we pretty much are in the same generation in the sense of what we were exposed to in fear of the decades that we were living in. Like the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, there were very specific fears and there were very specific doom prophecies that came about that got people in a panic. So just to kind of start in the 70s, we were dealing with the oil crisis here in the States. People had to line up for gasoline. It was ridiculously expensive. It was rationed. We were afraid of natural disasters. I mean, in the 70s, we had films about earthquakes, floods, comets. It was a doom and gloom generation because the 70s, coming out of the peace and love generation of late 60s, early 70s, all of a sudden took this really dark turn, right?
Yeah.
People weren't happy with the presidency in the United States. There were tensions worldwide. And so then you get films like Earthquake, The Last Wave, Zardoz, Silent Running, which is a film where the Earth is dead and there is one spaceship that has the last remnants of ecological life on it, right? Taking those first steps of what is going to happen to our climate and what's going to happen to our homeostasis on Earth and looking for ways to get it off of the planet. Well, it was creating a sense of doom and gloom that we were almost done. Damnation Alley, another film that's kind of underlooked, about a nuclear war that divides the country into two factions, essentially, and a virus breaks out, and one side of the country has the cure, and the other side has the disease, and so they create like this doomsday tank to go across the country to take the cure to the other end of the country. But in between, there's mutants, there's giant cockroaches, there's radioactive tornadoes. It was a decade of absolute fear and panic and doomsday prophecy. But then we get into the 80s and capitalism happens, right? And everyone seems to be happy. Everyone seems to be making money. Everyone seems to be rich. But at the underbelly of all that is the fear of nuclear terror. You get films like Red Dawn. You get films like The Day After. And a film from, or a miniseries from the UK, Threads, which is probably the most frightening and accurate depiction of what would happen after a nuclear holocaust. And it gets people all worked up again.
Yeah, it's and I think probably what things, especially like the last one you mentioned, Threads, there is how it makes it more relatable to the normal person. I think, you know, when like the ones you were saying in the 70s, these were very much very much, yeah, like you said, end of the world disaster. It's mutant aliens and creatures roaming wastelands, whereas something like Threads just is almost trying to pinpoint in on people's actual fear of what if a bomb goes off. I mean, you know, maybe the Cold War, I'm probably just that little bit too young to kind of remember or appreciate fully kind of the sensation. But, you know, we did have our own issues in this country with kind of bombs, you know, and then you start as a kid when you start hearing of the prospect of dirty bombs, and you just need that little notion in a film that unlocks that in your mind, your imagination, and that's it, because it makes it relatable, because it was in England, you know, it wasn't a big horror, a big sort of disaster film set in the States. This was down the road, half hour down the road from me, a couple of hours down the road, and it just makes it puts it on a more applicable level to you. And I think that's where sort of maybe some of those films, especially in the 80s, or you start seeing them honing in on people's real paranoia.
Well, and then it didn't just have to be with nuclear disaster, too. You know, there was also the sense of neo-fascism and dystopian societies that pop up in the 80s. So films like, let's say, Mad Max, not necessarily a film about nuclear disaster, more of a film of like running out your economical structure based on natural resources. And that's when you get these tribes of, you know, gas-hungry mutants and maniacs. And there were so many films like that in the UK and Australia.
Yeah.
Like Australia was really going hard in the paint of doomsday prophecy movies, whether it was Law and Order falls apart and all of a sudden there's going to be this rise in neo-fascism, but then also crazy tribes. There's a movie called Turkey Shoot from, I think, 80 or 81. And it's kind of a precursor to the Hunger Games, where we are in this, you know, dystopian neo-fascist society where anyone that doesn't have a good social credit is taken to this island where they're either re-educated or used as game for the elites to hunt out in the wilderness. You know, so these aren't new ideas that we're seeing in the 2000s and 2010s. Like, this is stuff that's been thought about for decades before us. Also, think about the films of John Carpenter that were, let's say, end-of-the-world doomsday films, specifically Prince of Darkness, where there is like a doomsday virus toxin. You've got The Fog. You've got In the Mouth of Madness, where essentially an author creates the end of the world that manifests itself and turns us into his reality. And then The Thing, which is now a play on the alien thing, where it's okay. There's been a species of alien here for thousands and thousands of years. We let it out of its frozen cage, and it essentially will turn us into it. Like, that's one of the things too, where now we're seeing people digging up in Antarctica and they're finding thousands of years old viruses, millions of year old worms and bacterias, and we're messing with it. We're poking the bear, and us as consumers are like, we've seen movies of this and where it goes wrong. Do we really want to be doing this?
And that's the thing now. And if you think about that, sort of, so from the 80s, we're talking about these viruses, and like you said, poking around. Now, obviously, fast forward 40 years later, and I know you'll probably cover decades, but we've obviously gone through the pandemic. So things like that now are going to hit harder. And back then it was just that, oh, it's fine. This won't happen. But now we've seen how quickly something can spread around the world and cause
Yeah.
devastation it did. So it almost goes back to what you were saying at the start. Are they prepping us? Are they sort of teaching us through films? It's tick another one off to say, right, that's not far fetched anymore.
It's odd that an interesting point came up in my Demolition Man conversation a few weeks ago about how does pop culture influence technology? Then how does technology influence pop culture? It's a chicken and egg thing, right? Like what came first? Because, we talked about Tesla in that episode where all the cars are battery fueled. They look like modern day Teslas. Did that inspire people who were making Tesla? Not Elon Musk, because he actually didn't make Tesla, or is it the opposite? Did we create the idea of it and then pop culture moves it forward and says, okay, well, if this is the idea now, what would the idea look like in 50, 60 years? I think Star Trek is a really excellent example of that. When Star Trek came out, they were introducing a lot of technologies that did not exist, that were not referenced to in any previous literature or media. But now, 60, 70 years after Star Trek first aired, we are seeing many examples of technology that have been somewhat derived from the ideas presented in science fiction. Things from cell phones and communicators and body scans and things like that. We haven't gotten transporter technology down yet, but people are working on it. Like they are able to transport like small bits of matter, not necessarily a human, but again, these are things that, are we manifesting our own stuff through pop culture, or is pop culture just taking a page out of what's already existing and moving it forward?
Yeah.
It's hard to tell, really.
And that's the interesting thing, if I can go to the Black Mirror episodes.
Yeah.
So I'm really, really enjoying watching those. It's been a while since I saw them originally, and seeing them back to back is just fascinating. And it's really interesting what you say about which is influencing what's influencing what, because I look back at those and I do a little bit of research around it, and we had the episode, there's one right at the start where people are living in almost like they're just cycling all day. They're just providing energy for who or what you don't know. When I was looking it up, a year or two later, there was a prison in Brazil, I think, that was offering inmates time off their sentence if they would cycle 8 hours a day for providing energy, or to provide power. And there are so many things where it looks like he's predicted the future, and there's always the jokes with the Simpsons, right, predicting everything. But what you're looking at is how far off is there a little bit of that technology's already there. It's not maybe too difficult to think, right, what the next level of that could look like. Okay, and then you multiply it by 2 to just give it a proper sci-fi or thriller feel. But I think from any of these things, we're probably only a few steps away, and it just takes, somebody to look at it and say, right, let's try and make that happen. We've seen with the person you mentioned, at the head of Tesla now, looking at neural link technology. I mean, how do we think that's going to go, right?
Well, in my opinion, with all the failed things that have been happening with that company, I don't think it's going to be that guy that's going to get that technology off the ground. It's going to be someone else who's not so interested about his presence on social media. Here's my question for you with The Simpsons, because I was going to bring that up later, is that I think it's really interesting that there are people out there who are like, see, the elites are telling us, the writers from Simpsons, they're all Harvard guys, right? And these Harvard guys are usually in secret societies, and these secret societies are run by the ultra elites, the New World Order, so to speak. And so maybe that is them using their Harvard connections to funnel these little tidbits of information to us to prepare us for whatever's coming. Or smart writers will make the joke so obvious, and that's why it works. That's what satire is. You're literally taking the most obvious thing that's going on in society, making a joke out of it, and the joke could be so ridiculous because it's true.
Yeah.
The truth is always more ridiculous than fiction. And I think that's where clever writers come in. That's where they can sometimes feel prophetic. Shakespeare did that. Shakespeare was writing all about the kings and the queens and the societies and all these different governments of the world at the time and how they were collapsing through all their bullshit. They hated him for it because it was really painting a picture of what was really going on, but he was doing it through comedy and satirical plays, right? What's the difference between that and what the Simpsons are doing, right? You're painting a very clear picture of what's going on. You're just giving it a little bit of comical and satirical flair that gets people all worked up, though. It's like, what do they know? Well, they know what we all should know, that the world's ridiculous, and they're just putting it on paper.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there, isn't there? I mean, if you are writing stories for 40 years, you're bound to hit on things that are going to happen. And especially, like you said, I think some of these things have always happened. Like, history has a way of repeating itself, but we are in a world now where, again, go back to what I said at the start with social media, everyone can forensically investigate everything. And you say, oh, look at this thing from 10 years ago. It's almost the same as what's happening now. It was probably that thing 10 years ago might have been looking at something that happened 10 years prior, but we just don't have, this is the point in time the most where it just feels like everything is just always there for your attention. And we just didn't do it for. I used to, when I was a kid, would come home, there'd be news on the TV 3 times a day. That would be it. I wouldn't see news outside of those times. You'd have the newspaper, but that was the days, the stories from when it was printed the night before. And that was it. We are just in a constant 24-hour cycle of everything being available. So I just think now people are able to find something that's happened around the world and link it to a show. And also, right, we're 2024, the last couple of years, it does feel like we could just be in an episode of The Simpsons. I wouldn't be surprised anything coming true at this point. You could say anything, and it feels like, yeah, go for it. It feels like, yeah.
And my personal opinion is that they're not manufacturing us. They're not tempering us, right?
Yeah.
No, they are literally, and here's the thing. I think also some of these, I don't want to call them dummies. They're not very open to other forms of thought. They're really kind of closed in their little echo chamber box, like you said. But do you understand how writing rooms work? Like writing rooms for sitcoms, especially things like The Simpsons, there's probably 1,000 ideas pitched out per episode. And these guys have to decide on what they're going to put in the episode. It's essentially one giant wall full of sticky notes.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, well, Homer goes to New York, or Homer goes to Washington, D.C., and Homer runs into Trump. Those 3 ideas on the board are 3 of 1,000 just for one episode.
Yeah.
So you are going to hit the dartboard eventually on something. That's my opinion. Now, I want to go back through the decades because it's interesting where we see genuine fears in society and then compare them to either films or television that was essentially linear with it during that time. So in the 70s, the biggest fears in society were government cover-ups, the Vietnam War protests, gas shortages, feminism, hijackings, and you want to know what else? Killer bees.
Wow. Okay.
Killer bees, especially in the States. There was this fear that Africanized honeybees had made their way down to the Amazon for something. Like some guy was trying to cross-pollinate, and they were making their way up through, and being a child of the 80s, this was still going on in the 80s, right? We'd see on the news, oh, the killer bees have now hit Texas, and they've now hit Arizona. We had this crazy fear that killer bees were going to take over the world. In response to that, there were at least 7 films about killer bees that came out in the late 70s and early 80s. Some of them were just total schlock, and some of them had actual actors in them. Like Henry Fonda was in one called The Swarm. Like they were big budget movies.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
Gas shortages. Okay, so we already talked about the Mad Max films. And then Vietnam War protests and ecological disasters. Well, do you remember the film Soylent Green? About the future where the ecological systems failed and the government is in control of what our food source is. And it's a thing called Soylent Green. And we all think it's some kind of like weird soy protein or whatever, just whatever they're giving us to eat. And it's actually, spoilers, people.
Yeah.
Yeah, the stuff that we were seeing in the 70s that was happening in real life was making its way into our media because it's like a horror movie. We like to be scared. We enjoy being emotionally shaken. And so to go see a film, especially one that has a crazy twist ending or an ending that kind of blows our mind, Black Mirror is a perfect example of that. Well, then you're going to go talk about it and you're going to start having these discussions with friends and family, and then they're going to think about it, and then they're going to go see it, and then they're going to expand on that. So now it's in the zeitgeist. And it takes, let's say, another big social fear or disaster to wipe that one clean and start a new one. What were the things that you remember being, or at least in the UK, being afraid of during your childhood?
In my childhood, it was odd. I do think because we were so small a nation, and we are an island, it felt really kind of really small level. We did have we did have an issue with terrorism, domestic terrorism in the 80s, and I remember that was what worried me. And it's funny, we were talking about this last night here, and I can't remember why. So there were films about, like you were saying, about hijackings and terrorism. But if we go to the other extreme, when you were saying, because I chuckled when you said about the bees, but we would always get stories about the poisonous spiders and snakes and insects that were coming over in our fruit shipments, and that they were going to take over our domestic wildlife, and we were going to sort of be basically sort of running away from tarantulas, scorpions, and all sorts in little old England, where we don't get anything like that. So as a kid, for me, it was those kind of two extremes. It was either kind of domestic, kind of like the domestic terrorism, or imported killer animals, basically. Yeah.
So in the 80s, several things happened that essentially bled their way into our mass media and our entertainment and our pop culture. So in 1980, Quebec held a referendum of wanting to essentially secede from Canada and become a sovereign state because they were concerned about the liberalism of the rest of the nation. And at the time, Pierre Trudeau, who was the Canadian president, prime minister, whatever, was able to get this shut down before it became anything big. But just that idea alone is what manifested Handmaid's Tale. Gilead essentially was like the response to that. It was a book, then it was a film, and now it's a very popular series about, oh no, what's going to happen, where neoconservatism is going to break away from the liberal mindset of certain countries and create like this weird, oppressive, fascist state. It almost happened. Now, I don't think it was going to be as aggressive as what we see in science fiction, but it planted the seed, right? And that was a fear that, okay, are people going to secede? We're talking about Texas right now in my country, where it's like there are thousands of people who say that Texas should secede. It might be a birth of a new civil war. I don't think that's going to happen because we'll quash it before it happens. But I mean, I don't think the people of Texas realize that, okay, if you secede, then all of the government jobs are gone. All the military jobs are gone. You're essentially on your own. Who's to say that Mexico's like, oh, we want Texas back, and they just take it, and the government's not here to do anything about it? Like, I don't think people think about it. They think about the idea more than they think about the details. Another thing that was a fear was birth rates plummeting due to the introduction of contraceptives in the 60s, 70s, and that it was going to affect the 80s. Well, we had the book written and the film eventually made, Children of Men, where children are no longer being born. The world is coming to an end, more than likely because of a virus or some kind of reaction to the mass contraception movement. What do we see with that? We see all these groups of politicians that are banning abortion, they're banning contraceptive pills, even condoms. Like, there's all these bills in play. Again, that is fodder for fear-mongering science fiction, and we see it in our media. Again, Handmaid's Tale, Children of Men. And I think that's why those films resonate, is because we see enough in our news and in our news cycle, and then we see it represented in film and in books. And sometimes I think our brains just attach the two together a little bit too closely. we take reality and common sense out of it and go into the fantasy because we have brains that are addicted to fantasy.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. I think I think, like you said, there is an element, especially it goes back to what we're saying. If they can lock into the paranoia that certain people are feeling, it then just can explode. And probably the things for me, I think the things that I remember more are later on in the decade. So, I'm sorry if I steal your thunder, like Y2K. For I remember here that was the thing I probably remember first being something that gripped people, and a little sort of maybe some ironic tongue-in-cheek articles in a paper or something can then make people absolutely believe everything else that they're going to see. And it just needs that little nugget of truth, that little not even necessarily truth, but if you can successfully sort of convince someone something's going to happen by either there being an element of truth, or you overcomplicate things and you get like an expert to say this is absolutely what's going to happen, then like you said, let the imagination, it's the people's imagination that are going to do the work for you.
One of the things about my idea of fear once I got older, because in the 80s we did have that constant fear of nuclear war with Russia, and it was very clearly represented in our TV shows. It was very clearly represented in our miniseries, like I said, The Day After and Threads, and then Red Dawn of like, okay, well, an actual invasion, which is a lot less likely than a nuclear war, but still, it put people on that idea of like, this could happen. And then we kind of went through like this peaceful time with Russia. Who knows if it was really peaceful? It could have been just like another Cold War thing, but it's all boiling up again, and maybe things are cyclical. They just have to happen and people have to get it out of their system. And who knows, that might be a world war situation or not. I'm not an expert on that. But the fears that definitely resonated with me growing up as I hit my teenage and adult years, I agree. It really started with Y2K. And I personally wasn't afraid of it, but the fact that you had stores like Best Buy and Walmart and Circuit City having stickers all over their windows saying, turn off your computers at midnight. And the idea that planes were going to be falling out of the sky and the stock market was going to collapse and all these different things. That was like the first moment of fear that I really took credible. Just that not as much me worrying that was going to happen. It was more about worrying what other people were going to do. Doomsday preppers or people that were going to storm the streets and storm the buildings and loot and riot. Like that was stuff that was very, very on the radar with mass media and with mainstream media. Now, it didn't really happen, and it kind of made a lot of people look foolish, but I think it also gave a lot of future conspiracy theorists the idea that, oh, well, people can be manipulated if they're not well educated. People can be manipulated if they're not really focused on other worldly things than just what's happening on their TV screen. And that was the first time I'm like, oh, maybe society is more fragile than I thought it was if people can get freaked out over this thing that we're seeing on the news.
That's exactly it. So when I go back to things that I was thinking of in the 80s and early 90s, those were things that I was worried about and paranoid about happening. As we said, Y2K was the first one where I saw a mass sense of panic. It was the first kind of group hysteria, for want of a better word or term. And as you say, here we had government produced pamphlets that went out to say how you prepare for it and what companies need to do. And I worked at a company where they were having to do a load of work, sort of patching systems and updating systems. And yeah, I don't think I was ever absolutely worried that, as you said, the proper scenario, lifts were just going to stop working and planes and vehicles.
Right.
But there was always that, right, okay, it's coming up to midnight now. Look out the window kind of thing and just see, just to see was there going to be like a level of an event that was going to happen. But it didn't. It just turned over and it was just the 1st of January, right?
So the other thing too that was big in the 90s and 2000s was viruses. So the book The Hot Zone came out. The film, I think it was 96 or 97, Outbreak came out. And yeah, it put a good level of fear into us. So like, okay, would our government nuke a city to kill a virus? They probably would. They would probably do anything they had to keep a virus from spreading. And then the biggest fear, according to some of these charts of what media inflamed these fears, was Ebola.
Yeah.
Like once Ebola started showing up, people were freaking out because they'd seen movies like Outbreak and they'd seen movies or TV shows or books like The Hot Zone. It's like, oh, this is going to happen. This is 100% going to happen. Now, that never really mutated into an airborne virus like in those books and in those movies, so we didn't have to, worry about it, but still we get these scares. And then the next one was SARS. SARS kind of freaked people out. It was essentially the precursor to COVID. I think they're even the same family of virus. And then the other one I remember hearing a lot about in the late 2000s and early 2010s was bird flu and swine flu. Like that was going to take us out. Everyone be prepared. Bird flu and swine flu is coming. And that brings me to that movie that came out, I think it was in 2010 or 2011, called Contagion. Steven Soderbergh directed it. Gwyneth Paltrow eats a pig at a restaurant. That pig was bitten by a bat somewhere, wherever she's at. I think she's in Vietnam or something. And then that causes this worldwide global pandemic. And so when COVID happened and the idea that it came from a mutated bat virus, then you get all the conspiracy theorists. And who knows? There might be some relevance to that. Maybe they did know something. Maybe someone saw something in a lab like, oh, that'd make a great story. And then it's almost like a confirmation bias, right? It's like, okay, I knew this was a thing and now I've seen it. I saw that movie 10 years ago and now it's happening in real life. They were telling us something. They were trying to prepare us. I don't know, man. It's interesting.
But that's the thing, and I'll go back to the point I was making about The Simpsons. If you were to go back in time, there will always been virus outbreaks of viruses that will have affected people. I mean, I think it was
the episode where the guy coughs in the box and it goes to Springfield.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think it was, in 1919 in Europe, there was a massive outbreak of the flu that decimated loads of people. And, and again, and I'm not saying, I'm not trying to sort of demean that one or a new one and not looking at anything sort of political. But what you were saying absolutely is the thing about, I guess, viruses and what makes them a great weapon in a film is that virus are unseen things. They're not a big sort of ugly monster. It's not a big meteor hitting, sort of powering its way to the earth. Right. It's something unseen. You wouldn't know. You wouldn't be able to avoid it, because you can't see it to avoid it. And that, when you've got that unseen, the unseen element of the boogeyman or whatever you want to say it, how do you evade something you can't see and don't know where it is and could catch from anyone? And the swine flu, I remember massively here because obviously, again, small country, but very agricultural, especially sort of many years ago rather than modern days. But you would have to go, if you were walking through the countryside or a place where animals were, you would have to get out. You'd have to walk through these like little disinfectant pads, or your car would have to drive through. And so even if you're not, you're not affected by the disease, you're having to do these little rituals rituals probably the wrong word, but these little actions,
procedures
to prevent spread. But by doing that, you're then subconsciously it's getting into you about what's happening in the wider. So even if you didn't believe in it, you would have to get out, you'd have to walk over to these disinfectant pads, you'd have to wash your hands at that station. And so it's just it's just kind of putting it into your brain, these things about what you'd have to do in this scenario.
Before we jump into the 2000s, I want to kind of go back and talk about films of the 90s that definitely have some relevance now, even though they were considered fantasy back then. So number 1, 12 Monkeys, directed by Terry Gilliam, about a manufactured virus that was unleashed in the world, and then Bruce Willis has to go back in time to try and prevent it because humanity's been forced underground. Seems fantastical, but that these days the idea of a manufactured virus is no longer a fantasy. We've seen it. We lived through nearly 3 years of it. We're still kind of living through it, and I don't think it's the last one that we're going to have to deal with. Works its way into our zeitgeist. Waterworld.
Okay.
You wouldn't think of it because it's kind of an action and adventure, but it goes back to the idea of climate change and polar ice caps melting and flooding. And, I'm not sure if you heard on the news, but there are cities in California that over the last year, home insurance companies have pulled out and are no longer insuring some homes in certain areas, especially those by the seaside.
Wow.
And then this week, a massive storm is supposed to hit California that California hasn't seen in like 100 years that could flood and destroy homes. It could be a disaster. Could be.
Mm.
It's not 100% confirmed, but it could be. Okay, so there's another one that are we about to lose our shorelines because of polar ice caps melting and all these storms coming through? It's an interesting idea. But I think the one, as technology has really started taking off and we're talking about virtual reality and augmented reality and Neuralinks, the Matrix.
Yeah.
I mean, the Matrix essentially has created this whole culture of people who are convinced that we live in a simulation. Even scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson haven't completely ruled out that theory. He doesn't think that it's robots that have created a simulation. He's like, okay, if we do live in a simulation, it's billions of years old and it's a simulation created by another force or another intelligence, and we're just like a microcosm of it. It's possible. No one's denying that. But when you hear about things like Mandela effects and we've altered timelines, the thing that I'm hearing a lot now is there are people who think that Y2K was it. That Y2K was the switch where technology took over. We are now living in an augmented timeline, in an augmented reality, and our Mandela effects are things that existed before 2000 seem different now. Whether it's someone that started a movie and then didn't, the Nelson Mandela conundrum, which is what the name is after. Did Fruit of the Loom have a cornucopia on the logo? Did it not? Most of those I think are kind of bullshit because I vividly remember things being the way they were and not the way that these Mandela effect people are. But it's a juxtaposition, right? Because if I'm convinced that they were one way and they're convinced of the other, then who's right? Like it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, I can't argue my point any better than they can argue their point. It's all of like, who remembers what, right?
And that's the thing. And it's funny because I've got an episode that I'm working on that's focusing purely on the Mandela effect. And, without giving too much of the material away. But it is, again, I'll go back to, I think social media is doing a lot of good, but also a lot of bad in this thing because you'll see somebody will put something on and that's fact then. And nobody necessarily goes to do any research about what things were. It's all of a sudden, it's like, and none of these are like anything that are horrendously different. It's like, another classic one is the Monopoly Man. Does he have a monocle or not?
Yeah, the monocle.
Look at that character. He could easily have a monocle or not. So, we're not talking about wide scale changes. We're talking about little things that you could easily misremember. The one I like, and again, it goes back to if you can find something that you can sort of put 2 and 2 together and maybe come up with 4, but possibly come up with 6, 7, or 8, is that do you remember? The Hadron Collider I think it's in underground in Switzerland. Yeah. There is somebody once, and I found the whole thread. It's deleted now, I think, but somebody is saying that when we did that, when we found that God particle, that was the end of the world as we know it, and we're now in a separate reality, and that's why things are different. It
bumped us into a different dimension.
Yeah, and it's like, well, in the end, who knows what we're going to uncover in the coming years? Who knows what? I'm not. We could find some really bizarre things, and
yeah, there was this. I think it was a Vine from years ago of this kid trying to explain how dimensions worked. And everyone's like, oh yeah, and after he did that kid disappeared. And he kind of did. No one saw him for years. And then just recently he posted another video that had another mind-blowing theory. It's like, oh, I guess we were wrong. He's here all along. But then you got like the deep conspiracy guys like, no, he's a clone. They cloned him to make us think. It's like they always have to take it one extra level.
Do you think, sorry, I'm derailing it there, but do you think it's because, do you think there's an element where people want to be in on something that they think is a conspiracy and be the first one? Like if you can throw something out there and then it does become true, do you think there's an element of people want to be in on something and be the groundbreakers to try and uncover that?
I think that's part of it, yes. But I think the main thing of it is I think that people are so just bored with reality. Reality is boring.
Yeah.
So to create something that seems so fantastical to bring a little bit more of interest and relevance to someone's existence, I think that's why QAnon was so big here in the States, is that these were people that literally did not do anything outside of watch Fox News all the time and read about conspiracies and government corruption. And there's always been government corruption. But all of a sudden, like, this gave them something to talk about, and there were other people that they could find online to talk about it, and it just grew because that fantasy was more interesting than what was really going on in the reality. That's what I really think most of it is.
Yeah.
That's not to say that someone with influence and power and control can recognize that in people and then use that to manipulate larger groups of people. There's always going to be someone who can recognize an opportunity to do either good or bad. More than likely, it's going to be bad. And all that does is add fuel to the fire, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's where I think about that.
Yeah.
So I think the doom mongering has really taken a step up in the last 20 years. You know, everything now is an end of days thing. I mean, I live in the state of Utah. The main religion here is the Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints. It's essentially a doomsday religion, right? It's a religion based on how to prepare yourself for the end of the world and the end of days. They paint a very happy, family-friendly picture on it, but it's in the goddamn name. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The world is ending. We got all these doomsday preppers. The industry of doomsday prepping here is huge. We've got army surplus stores up the ass. We've got people making dehydrated food buckets and making millions off of them. Is it profiting off of doom mongering? 100%. But they, for the most part, really, really believe it. Now, at the same time, I think that the elites of the church don't. I think they are just exploiting the willingness of its followers. That's why they're asking for all these tithings. They own billions and billions of dollars of stock that they don't share with its congregation. Like, it's kind of messed up. But if the Church of Jesus Christ can do that, who's to say that the Vatican can't do that? Who's to say that, you know, the financial institutions, BlackRock, all this stuff that people are talking about aren't doing that? And that's what can get someone really just deep into these conspiracies. So in the last 20 years, we've seen a few films that really are painting an interesting picture of what could possibly be the end of our existence as we know it. So one of the ones I think is really interesting was 28 Days Later, written by Alex Garland, directed by Danny Boyle, about a virus that turns us into essentially mindless zombies. We're not eating people, but it's a rage virus. It essentially is like a form of rabies. And if you bite someone or scratch someone, they get it too. And then society collapses and it's all about survival. Interesting concept. Doesn't seem too out there, especially with what we've seen of how, you know, government and public responses are, the fear mongering of it. The other one I think that's really interesting is Interstellar. Now, while it's mostly a sci-fi film about finding another planet for us, think about why. You know, it's the ecological thing again. And to me, the ecological fear is the one I'm most convinced is going to happen first. You know, yeah, there could be wars. I think that there is a very fine line where we know not to push it too far unless we got someone crazy like North Korea. But I think it's going to be ecological, in my opinion, that's going to wipe us out first. You know, we're going to see famines and dust bowls and crazy storms, and that's going to mess things up. So even though that's more of a science fiction outer space film, the reason why they're doing it is the one that's more convincing to me. Already discussed Children of Men. Now, the one that's getting a lot of hype these days just came out on Netflix, and it's called Leave the World Behind. And conspiracy theorists are going nuts about it because Obama and his wife produced it. They were financiers for this movie. And it's essentially about how foreign nations are going to bring us down by shutting down our power grid. And there are government projections that if our power grid shut down on a nationwide level, within the first year, 90% of the population would die. That's scary as shit because it could happen. And so people are saying they're preparing us for it. They're tempering us in this idea of this is going to happen, but they're passing it off as entertainment. And the elites of the world are paying people like Julia Roberts and Ethan Hawke to be in these movies. because they want to put a pretty face or a face that we are convinced that we can trust. These are actors and movie stars that we've been growing up with. So there's a comfort to it. We're going to watch it. But at the end of the day, they're preparing us for what's going to happen. Again, it's classic doom mongering, and I just don't know what to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, prepare us how though? I mean, what is that preparing us for? In the end, the normal person on the street isn't going to get any bunkers or anything. So that's the question I say. What are they preparing us for? Just the fact that we are going to be wiped out. If that's the case, then just let us go in our ignorance, right?
Right. But then at the same time, they're feeding us stories of like, okay, Mark Zuckerberg's building a bunker in Hawaii.
Yeah, we've
and
heard that
Bezos
here.
bought an island. Like, billionaires are preparing. Well, billionaires have been preparing forever, right?
Yeah.
Billionaires have been preparing forever. Branson bought an island back in the 80s because he was afraid of nuclear war.
Yeah.
Just because they're doing it doesn't necessarily mean that they know something's going to happen. If I had $1 billion, I'd be preparing for something, right? It's not saying that they're setting this up and they're preparing, because the other conspiracy is that billionaires want to pull a Lex Luthor and wipe out all the things that we hold dear or all the things that keep us as a society together. And then when society starts to rebuild, the billionaires will own everything, and then we are now indentured slaves to them. I hate to break it to you people, but we're already indentured slaves to the government in a sense, like with our taxes, with our cost of living. Like, the majority of the societies are really just working day to day. We pay money for a car that gets us to work, right? And come home. Like, some of us get the chance to take holidays, a lot of us don't. So it's just the same idea of what we're living already, just enhanced and dramatized in these movies, in my opinion.
The other thing about some of these events is, what happens after is going to be the big issue. We see it in the films, but we've also seen in real life that the biggest problem when you have one of these cataclysmic events isn't the event itself, is how people treat each other, right? It's often, you don't look at the event, you look at the people. The Walking Dead is kind of like one of those things, right? We've seen here during the pandemic how in certain examples, people could be really selfish in terms of, instead of buying just a couple of what they need from the store, they're like literally sweeping the shelves clean and things like that. And so whatever they're preparing us for, what they can't prepare is how people are going to be treating each other afterwards, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. The only thing I can say is because I've watched enough of the Black Mirror and I've watched enough of these movies where a lot of it can be manufactured and enforced. If you start dividing people up into groups that already don't like each other in the basis of, okay, well, we need to separate people because of the virus, well, you can create contentions that were already there and just make them a lot more powerful. Conflict, conflict is profitable.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I think it was in JFK, the movie JFK, where Donald Sutherland's explaining to Kevin Costner about why Kennedy was assassinated, one of the reasons why. And the theory is that you need war to build your economy. So before Vietnam, which Kennedy didn't want to do, we were sitting on all of this old military equipment and armory and stuff like that from World War II, and we needed fresh supply. So what do? We go to war, essentially destroying all the old stuff to create a boom of an economy to build new stuff. And then we do it again, and then we do it again. We sell the old stuff to Afghanistan, and then we have that conflict. We essentially create ISIS with that, so we can build new stuff. It's not a secret. It's there.
See, war is an interesting one, because that is now feels like it's coming back round in terms of maybe a younger generation here, because there were some comments made by, I can't remember, there was a politician about our army not being big enough. And so now for about a week, if you looked on TikTok, it was all about, should conscription come back in the UK? Conscription's coming back.
They're talking about it here in the States too. Yeah.
Yeah. And now you can see that that's potentially, is that a genuine concern, or is it a way of bringing people back in a section of a generation back into control, if you know what I mean. Is it, is there something along that? But it feels like, the war is coming back full circle. It's going to be interesting to see that, because we have got a number of conflicts, especially sort of near our doorstep. But for many years, it was the ecological disaster. But it's going to be interesting to see what the next decade looks like.
You know what they're saying right now, the conspiracy guys, which is interesting. I find it interesting. I'm not bought into it, but right now here in the States, we're seeing these massive, massive corporate layoffs, and the job market's hard to fill, right? And there's this talk about conscription coming back. So there's things that are really interesting to that idea, where it's like, okay, so now we have all these unemployed men between 20 and 35 that have been laid off from their jobs as, Amazon shelf stockers or truck loaders and stuff like that. Anyone who's not unionized or anyone who's not in a more corporate setting, you're seeing these massive layoffs of blue collar people. So what's their next best option? Okay, well, if war is coming, we could use you for a military. And now here's the other part that's interesting. What's been huge among males 20 to 35 in the last 15 years? Call of Duty Modern Warfare. People are already starting to train themselves online. There's people that play this shit for 10 hours a day or more, and their brains are already hyper-focused in on combat, on strategy, on skill and statistics. So the conspiracy that I'm hearing now on TikTok is potential war, lack of ranks in the military, layoffs, and a whole generation who is submerged in the idea of conflict because of video games are the perfect target to do conscription. I think it's crazy, but just like The Simpsons, man, you throw enough darts at the board, you're going to hit something. So who's to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like you're saying, the Call of Duty, because you've already got a generation of ready-made. There are some people there that know the noise of guns just from, or a gun from the reload, just because they've heard it in Call of Duty. It's crazy. It's crazy. So you've already done half the work.
They just made that movie Gran Turismo about the kid who was a racer because he was racing virtually in Gran Turismo. It's feeding the same machine. So again, and the point of this episode is for not us to create doom mongering, right? It's just a conversation and discourse about what we've seen. My whole point, my conclusion to this is that what we're seeing is no different than what we've seen in every decade for as long as mass media has existed. From the 30s and 40s of newsreels in front of cartoons to get people excited to join the army or buy war bonds. We've been doing this for as long as we've had ways to communicate with each other thern smoke signals. It's just now, like you said, we're in a 24-hour cycle of information. And when you put that much information out there, you're going to have a lot of false information. You're going to have a lot of real information that slips through the cracks or gets manipulated by the false information. And the people that just want to create hyperbole because it's fun or because it makes them feel like they have purpose, right? Like dudes that have no outside life feel like a rock star because they have 1,000 followers on TikTok as they spout flat earth conspiracies, It's just one of those things. Humans have ego. These social media devices fuel ego of people that should not necessarily have a platform, but our freedom of speech protects it. So it's up to us of how we're going to disseminate that information and pass it off as just fun and fantasy, or are we going to let it influence us into our daily lives?
Well, that's the problem. The rumor spreads really quickly. The retraction or the denial never really makes a front page or never makes a dent in people. That's the issue. That's what I'm saying. You can feed something, you can make something grow, a rumor or a conspiracy of something, but a retraction is always buried. If it was a newspaper, we'd say it's buried on page 25 in the bottom corner, and nobody ever reads it.
I hope we didn't scare everybody, but I knew you were the right person to talk about this with because, listening to your show every week and knowing you for as long as I have now, you're a guy that loves to dig for answers. Not necessarily the truth because we don't know what's really true anymore, but we expand our conversation and our knowledge base off of, all these things that just seem ridiculous to us, and then we see how relevant they actually are to modern society, whether it's wacky laws or crazy lawsuits or doom and fear mongering in social media and mass media. And yeah, I'm glad that we were able to have this talk.
No, thank you for having me on. And like you said, I just love talking. And like you said, that's where some of the best things happen, is just being able to have a conversation about things, right? That's it. It doesn't matter whether you agree with me or I agree with you. Just having this conversation is the biggest thing.
And there's something that is a little bit, I don't know, rewarding to me to think that some of the most ridiculous B-movie genre film cult films about the end of the world, and if one of them gets it right, I'd be like, wow, I didn't think that it was going to be The Swarm and Killer Bees or mutinized bunny rabbits like Night of the Lepus are going to take out the world. Hey, good on you.
Oh dear, yeah. Look forward to the repackaging of that 20 years afterwards. Yeah.
Oh, right. So Dan, what's coming up on Casting Views?
I have got, actually, I was saying, as I said, it's quite coincidental. I am looking at picking on a couple of so-called conspiracy theories. I'm looking at delving into that. So I am doing one on the Mandela effect, deep dive into that. I've got a couple of episodes coming up with our friend Justin on the Movie Wire. Actually, I'm looking at doing, you see, and that's what you're saying. I kind of like to do some things that are semi-serious and some things that are just out there. So we'll be doing one on record breakers, some bizarre, people doing bizarre things. And I've actually got another, because I'm looking at, the Black Mirror sub-series will be coming to an end shortly as we're racing through the episodes. I'm looking at doing another program based around shows. But I'll leave it at that for now. But also, while I've got you on again, just want to say thank you to you. One, for my logo, my pod logo, but also so I was caught in a need to get someone on once. You stepped in with about 5 hours, I think, and we did the dinner party episode. And since that, it's spawned a whole. I'm doing one a month now, and it's one of my favorite episodes doing that now. And yeah, you were sort of right there at the start. So yeah, each month I do a dinner party episode, and it's slowly becoming one of my favorite episodes to do.
Yeah, it's great. It gets you to know the people that have been on the podcasts or in the podcast world for a while, and getting to know them better and see what drives the way they think and what their motivations are. So yeah, I've been loving those too.
Yeah.
Well, man, like I said, I always love having you on. You're one of my best podcast friends, and we've actually had a chance to meet in person, which was great. And I just can't wait to do more episodes with you and just keep pushing our podcast forward. So once again, I appreciate you coming on board, and I'll talk to you in the chat rooms for sure.
No, thank you, my friend. Thank you.
So everyone listening today or watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast on YouTube and your favorite listening platform. Please subscribe to Casting Views. He's on all pod platforms and all over social media. It's a great podcast with a new guest every week. And again, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.